Buenos dias. Thank you for joining us for Bienvenidos, a CBA-DBA limited series podcast celebrating Hispanic Heritage Month. A term that, as you will hear, can be both celebratory and controversial, as well as inclusive, yet isolating. Join Annie Martínez, the current second vice president of the Denver Bar Association and past president of the Colorado Hispanic Bar Association, as she explores the backgrounds and careers of some of Colorado's inspirational Hispanic and Latin lawyers.
Hola, mi gente. Welcome to Bienvenidos, a limited series podcast for Hispanic Heritage Month. This is Annie Martínez, your DBA second VP, and I'm happy to be leading the discussion today regarding being an agent of change and change makers in the Hispanic community in Greater Colorado. In our studio today, we have the distinct pleasure of having Juan Marcano and Crystal Murillo of Aurora City Council. And so thank you for being in the studio today, you both.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
Yeah, thanks, Annie. We appreciate it. Excited.
Yeah, so I'm not sure our listeners how up to date they are with who's in Aurora City Council. Some of us, if we're not even living in Aurora, this may not be something we follow. But you're two very prominent, very amazing, young Latinos representing our community in elected office. And so I really wanted to have a conversation with both of you about what it is to make change and what it is to advocate for a community, and for a community that's not necessarily always treated with the respect that it deserves, right? So we know from the census data that Colorado is about, 21, almost 22% Hispanic, or identifying as Hispanic. So it's gone up. And we know that there is a pretty large contingency of Hispanic community in the Aurora area. And so let's start off first with introducing you guys, because I don't think everyone knows you all. And so let's start off with Juan. Do you think you could give us just a little bit about yourself, your background, or give us a lot of it?
So Juan Marcano, I represent Ward 4 on the Aurora City Council. My family's from Puerto Rico. I was actually born in Bayamon, and we moved all over the place. I think it's a very common story for a lot of Puerto Ricans. There's like a generational diaspora. Basically, every 20 years or so, a bunch of folks move out of the island. Mm-hmm. So we moved around to, where did I live growing up? Orlando, Christmas, Houston, Plano, McAllen, and then back to Houston.
Wow.
And actually back to Puerto Rico at one point in there too, because I think I did, if my memory serves, I did kindergarten, or part of my kindergarten in Houston, and then I finished first grade in Puerto Rico
cool.
at San Ifel in Fajardo. So yeah, it's, we moved around a lot. My parents are both retail workers. So they just kind of went where the money was at, right? And then finally settled in Houston when my dad finally became a manager and we were able to afford a house.
Nice.
But before then, just apartments, cohabitating with my grandparents, big households, you know how it goes.
Big households, small
houses. Yes, exactly. Yeah, so, I think kind of like a solidly working class background. My parents had a lot of struggles that, frankly, played into my childhood and the childhood of my sisters, I remember my dad told me something when, I was getting into my early teens. And I didn't quite really grok it at the time, but, as I got older and, especially after I moved out and started getting into politics, I really understood what he meant. And that's that his goal was to raise me and my sisters like middle-class white kids.
Wow.
So, yeah, and it's my sisters, they understand Spanish, but they don't speak it. Yep. I half speak it. I speak Spanglish.
Yeah.
I know that.
Spanglish is its own official language. Yes. One day it will be recognized.
Yeah, when I speak English, I sound more Texan than, Latino.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, so it's that kind of an experience. And it changed, it's a different perspective growing up, getting into the professional world. My background is architecture and engineering design. Mm-hmm. So I was a BIM manager for a multinational firm before I jumped into politics. But it's an interesting space to navigate because you're often the only person of color in very white rooms, very white, very male rooms. Yeah. And it's starting to change a little bit. In the 13 years that I've been working in that industry, I was the only one or one of two. Out of a group of 100 plus, right? Mm-hmm. But it's starting to change, which is good. But it makes for a really interesting dynamic, especially when I was working in Texas, let me tell you. So, yeah, but we can maybe dive into that in a little bit. I want to let Crystal go. So,
all right, Crystal. So why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and your background?
So, your story starts with not you, but your family. My family's from Mexico, from the Guadalajara area. They emigrated to the U.S. Several decades ago, 40 plus years. So made their way, working all the jobs that they could through California. And then so my mom and my aunt, the eldest of the 6 kids, they were born in Mexico. All of them made their way up to California. The third kid was born there, always moving to seek opportunity, right? So moving through California, made their way to Phoenix. And, we have family kind of all over as a result. So made their way there, a couple other kids born there. And then we landed in Colorado. And that's and Aurora, specifically kind of the Aurora area. So that's, how we got here as a family. So Aurora is my home. I was born actually in Phoenix, but came to Aurora, I think less than a year old. So that's hometown for me. And I've just grown up there. I went to 8 different schools. My mom was a single mom. And, she had 2 kids and really had to kind of navigate being an immigrant in this country, trying to, work her way and support her kids in that situation, which, is not like a new story that I hear, from a lot of my friends or folks that I know. Aurora is very diverse, and my district or the Ward 1 area is 57% Latino. So I'm not surprised that that's, without knowing that data, like knowing my own history independent of that and like having it validated just after the fact with those numbers, you kind of realize and like understand kind of how that migration happens. So yeah, I went through the Aurora Public Schools, Cherry Creek School Districts, graduated as the first person to get a high school degree in my family, and then on to the University of Denver to get the first college degree. So I just have never been very far, right? Like I've traveled certainly, but I've never left home, which I think is also very Latino, right? Like I always want to be close to my family when I think of like, I just bought my first house.
Congrats.
And I have to live in my district, but I always want to be close to my community, my people. So, for me, now as like a young professional city council member by night, and then I work at the University of Denver still in the Office of Undergraduate Admission as my quote day job. But yeah, I mean, I love to like infuse like my lived experiences in my work, and I feel like I get to do that on a policy level when I am on my city council role, and then at DU when I am I work on a diversity and access team. I specialize in strategic partnership and kind of the access work there. So I guess the history is there, but I guess I'm just really proud and like excited and privileged in a lot of ways to be able to get to do what I want. And because of that lived experience, right? Like it's those sacrifices that gave me the opportunity to do and to be here, right? To be talking about these things.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a common thread a lot of us can talk about in terms of like what our families have sacrificed and also done in just compounding amounts in terms of like what you might see another family. Not saying that people don't put in as much effort into their kids, but just when you're an immigrant background, or not necessarily an immigrant because Puerto Rico is part of the States, but when you're migrating like that, and you're doing it for survival and to get a step ahead each time, that's not only kind of a unifying thread amongst many Hispanic and Latinos in Colorado, but across the country, but also to your point, both of you, I think you mentioned the diversity that exists in Aurora. There is a lot of, immigrant communities there, whether they're third, second, or first generation, that unifying thread of they did so much and sacrificed so much so that I could be that one level higher again. And I heard a lot of the same that you mentioned, Juan, about like, I want you all to be able to live like, middle-class white kids. I don't want you to struggle. I don't want you to think about the things that we've had to think about. And, to varying degrees, they're successful, right? And then there's also the other parts that they're not aware of that experience puts on your shoulders. But it's definitely done with love. I wanted to highlight one thing though that you didn't say, Crystal. I mean, you're like the oldest and like the millionth Latina in Aurora City Council, right? That's what the stat is.
That's what that is. No, well, since we're talking about it, yeah. So, I guess I kind of glossed over the part that when I was first elected in 2017, I was 23 years old. So I was the youngest in Aurora's history. And I was also the first Latina, which, like I said, my district was 57% Latino. Kind of blows my mind. But at the same time, it doesn't, right? Like folks, I don't think traditionally have paid attention to more local politics. I think you're supposed to vote every 4 years for the president, and like that's kind of the bar. Speaking of bars, so let's not gloss over that.
Well, no, and I think it ties into a lot of stuff we've talked about in terms of kind of norms that we see in the Hispanic and Latino community of, you're focused on getting by, you're focused on your day-to-day. And then if you're that first generation kid as an adult, the pressure to succeed sometimes doesn't let you open your eyes to these other types of opportunities, right? Like, so for me, it was, girl, you go to law school and make money. Because we are never going to be living paycheck to paycheck or no check to no check ever again. And I'm sure to some extent for both of you, that's kind of similar of like, no, you need that financial stability. And when you're so, it's like the hierarchy of needs, right? If you're always at the bottom part, you never get to the higher up ones, the more nuanced ones. And so individuals like us, like you two specifically, you're breaking the mold and breaking that barrier of running and winning in these spots because it is absurd. It is completely disparate that an award that is majority Latino is not being represented by a Latino. And I think that anyone who hears that would go, oh, what? How did that fly? And the issue is, not only we can talk about all the systemic issues that keep our communities and other communities like us out of these roles, right? Like that's a whole other podcast probably. But aside from like the structural stuff, you also have your innate personal stuff of like, I don't have time for this. I got to make sure like my family's good. And I don't think city council for some of these like positions like DPS also like it's either non-paying at all, it's voluntary. You got to keep both of you like you all working while you're trying to do this. Like it's set up in a way to be really, really difficult for our community and other communities like ours to attain that.
Absolutely.
And that's why maybe both of you can talk to that point a little bit. Juan, if you want to go first, just like what that experience was like for you personally.
Oh, for sure. When I initially set out to run, I thought that I was going to be able to keep my day job. I was a BIM manager, like I said at the time, and still be able to do council. But as that election drew closer, it's like, one, especially after having talked to like Crystal about like how demanding the job is, it's like, I don't know if that's necessarily feasible because my job is not really flexible. And two, like I wasn't going to be able to win, let alone serve if I didn't actually spend more time on doors, So it's not just the actual demands of the job, it's getting the job as well. You have to be in a position of privilege to do that. And I had, I basically cashed in some of my privilege chips there. That I was financially stable, and my wife also works, and earns a decent salary. That she could basically carry me for a couple of months until I either win or lose, and then get another job. But I mean, being on the inside now, like it's it's a glamorous job. It pays exceptionally well. We make $33,000 a year if you don't take the health insurance. So and I got to tell you, like I've never been busier. Like I would not have been able to serve my constituency and hold down my old day job at the same time. I just wouldn't have. And I know that I'm grateful that like some of the other folks who are on council who do have day jobs, they have at least some of that flexibility baked in. Like there's a lot of the way it's set up, like the system gets the results it's designed to get, right, until we break it and make it more equitable. But like I think there's a reason why the person that Crystal unseated with it was an 83-year-old retired Trump supporter. Like who's got the time to do this work for little money, and also like
it's no skin off their nose to be able to do it in a certain way.
No,
right?
for sure.
There's
like,
the skin in the game is not the same.
No, it really isn't. So it's not designed to let people who are more working class, who have different lived experiences that aren't necessarily caked in privilege, who aren't independently wealthy or already retired or just well connected to participate. So we have to kind of bend it and break it until we can make it do that. And I think that's hopefully something we'll be able to do in the future here.
Well, and kind of to your point, Annie, when I think about like, it was never like, I didn't run like against someone, right? Mm-hmm. Like I ran for something, like for the values that I believe in, for my community, for survival. Yeah. And I think that's what makes me like, it is the most stressful. Like I have 3 jobs right now, right? I'm running for re-election, I'm on council, and I have a full-time job. Like, wow. Sometimes I don't even know how I made it through the last year, but I do know why in some ways, because I truly believe that my survival as a person in this city, the people that I care about, that I love, you know, the high school teacher that I, you know, still run into that I went to elementary school with, or that my mom worked with, the grocery store worker, like I think it is the most frustrating, exhausting time in my life, but I feel like I am at a point in my prime in some ways. Yeah. Because I feel like being inextricably linked and like tied to the outcome of the things you're fighting for makes you a better advocate, right? So what I was frustrated about was, aside from like not representing the you know, the constituency, the demographics of the last person in this seat, was that this was like almost a volunteer position, like for fun, like because you have time, and like it's just the most frustrating thing, because I just felt like the votes there like exemplified that as well, right? Like just so many, I don't know, just like layers removed from the like actual lived experience of people who were going through things now. Like we need now, like what's going on now.
Yeah, definitely. I want to pivot a little bit, and let's see, Juan, if you can talk a little bit about your Puerto Rican heritage and how that demonstrates in your day-to-day in terms of like you as a person, but also as an elected official. You know,
you mentioned earlier, Puerto Ricans aren't like really immigrants because we're already U.S. citizens. And it's like, that's true. We are U.S. citizens, but Puerto Rico has a very different culture than the mainland USA. So we don't have to deal with the documentation aspect of immigrating and that struggle, which we can do a whole nother podcast on, I'm sure. Yeah. But it is a very different culture. And, that's it was one of the interesting experiences that I had growing up, and even still today. Like it's a kind of self-doubt that is instilled in me, I think, as a result, because I grew up basically being too white for the Latinos and too Latino for the white kids, you know what I mean? So like never really fitting in. And that kind of changes the way I approach, not just, professional and personal relationships, but also like politics, right? And, trying to understand like why my parents, that going back to what my dad told me, like that I want to raise you like middle-class white kids, like why did he have to do that? And what can I do in this position now of community trust and leadership to break down that necessity? I don't want people to feel like they need to abandon their culture or, basically assimilate their kids into whatever whiteness happens to be in that part of the country, right? I feel like that's basically what happened to us, but that they are free and, expected to express their culture, to preserve that, but also interweave it with the fabric of, the greater city in our case, right, of Aurora. So, and I feel like that's something that was missing with the way that we were raised. And again, I don't think it was a malicious intent. I think my parents did it out of a place of love. They thought that would be best for me and my sisters. Thinking back to the struggles my grandfather faced. He was a brilliant man. He was he was a veteran. He worked in oil and gas, but my understanding is that he had struggles finding employment because his English wasn't the best, right? His Spanish was amazing, but his English was not the best. And my grandmother, she never really learned English either, right? Yeah. So I feel like that experience for my grandparents on my mother's side informed how my parents decided to raise us, because they didn't want us to have that kind of a struggle, right? Or to hear an accent in our speaking and then
get called out.
Exactly. And have that trigger a negative impact on a potential employer, for example, right? So I guess their gambit to some extent worked out, right? But but it also comes with things like being told, oh, you're one of the good ones.
Oh, that's
you know,
the worst.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, and they say, you really make your people proud. What? What do you
It's
mean?
like, what do you mean?
I don't.
Excuse me?
It doesn't sound the way you think it sounds.
Right.
Yeah.
It's like, it's like, or you're so articulate. And it's like, I know that you mean that from like a good place, right?
Yep.
But it's like, oh, it's still just like.
Yeah, I get told my English is really good.
Right.
And I'm like, well, it was my first language. I
would
really
hope
would
so.
hope it is. So, you know, thanks. I think.
Yeah.
Maybe. I don't know.
Yeah. So like, you know, again, like the way that informs my approach to politics is trying to break down those barriers and, you know, see what it is that makes people feel that they need to do this. You know what I mean? Like, and let me tell you, like, I've been knocking a lot of doors because it's election season. So I'm out like in mobile home parks in Ward 2 because there's not a representative out there currently. And I'm, you know, talking to these overwhelmingly Latino communities in these mobile home parks. And the parents, when they open the door, they light up when I speak to them in Spanish, right? And then when they realize I'm there for elections, they bring the kid over because a lot of them aren't able to vote.
Yeah.
So, and then the kids speak perfect English to me
Yeah.
and struggle with the Spanish.
Yep.
You know what I'm saying? So like, it's that kind of a,
That's been my experience too.
yeah. And it's like, it's kind of, it's sad to me in a ways because it's like what my parents, you know, again, for good reasons, I think from their perspective, like, but it's like, we're basically not destroying, but like setting aside our own cultures.
It's a deliberate disregard to be able to like track with the default, right? So I think like we, you know, recognizing that heteronormative, patriarchal, like that white normal, that white default is what's, you know, it's called the default for a reason. And so the minute you don't fit into that, there is a lot of pressure.
Absolutely.
And a lot of guilt for the parents, a lot of like self-doubt for you as the child in that unit, right? And I see that a lot here in Colorado. My parents preempted that. We were born in Chicago, and my parents looked at me and my brother with my dad's Tony Montana, you know, accent, talking like Scarface. Oye, Annie, ven pa' acá. My mom was like, bro, we're moving to Miami. Everybody in Miami's Cuban. I don't want my kids to ever feel othered.
Right.
And so they, you know, I got the lucky experience in that sense of like her being very self-aware because she came from Cuba when she was like 10 or 11. And so she had to do middle school in ESOL and like she went through it.
Yeah.
And she was like, look, it doesn't even matter how young you come or if you're born here. If you're other, you're other. And she didn't want us to experience that at all. So we got super spoiled growing up in Miami, in Hialeah particularly, which is like the Cubanist of the Cuban enclave outside of Cuba. I mean, like, it was like the people were coming and they were going straight to Hialeah. They'd get, you know, wet foot, dry foot. They touched land, they got to Hialeah. That is where I lived. And so for us, I didn't experience some of this stuff until college. And then I was like, oh, this is what everybody's been talking about that I've been blinded and protected from for the last 18 years of my life. Because when we left Chicago, I was little. I was kindergarten age. I don't remember squat. I remember growing up and being in Miami and we had definitely struggles there and different issues. And there's a lot of classism. There's a lot of colorism. Yep. You know, my dad's a lot darker. I came out very fair, comparatively speaking. Yep. And so, you know, people you get told like, oh, don't go out in the sun. You don't want to get any darker, that kind of stuff. Yeah, super weird. Super racist. Yep. But, yeah, definitely avoided that experience, but I see it a lot here in Colorado where either you have a lot of individuals who I feel take the perspective of the border cross them, and so they consider themselves like native Coloradans, and that might be, you know, to some extent Mexican heritage, but maybe for them it's really Coloradan heritage, and they're not really recognized that way, and they have, you know, Spanish surnames. They're over here Lucero and all this stuff, but their identity is different. And then you have the ones that have immigrated and have been made to feel like, put it in a box. Because the only part they like about us is our food and music. We can take those parts out, and we can, you know, do our little song and dance.
Though.
They're definitely good parts. They're also like the most palatable, right?
Yeah.
And so the rest of us has to stay in a box. And so then that's where that like that dynamic starts to grow in the intergenerational of like, well, we love abuelita, but you need to be as white as possible. you know, like 2 generations
that
down.
code switching is exhausting, right? And like having to do that, like, because I just until recently, like after I bought my first place, I was living with my mis abuelos, you know, and that was tough, right? So like, you know, I'm over here on a conference call with the governor and his staff in my room, and then, you know, they're like, all the kids that they're watching are like running around like screaming, and they're like, "Hey, mija, do you want to come?" I'm like,
¿Quieres fruta? ¿Quieres fruta? Tengo algo.
Like, it's comical, but legit was like, so it was tough. And like, you know, that's like such a small price to pay, like in regard to like just being able to like be with family. But that code switching is real. Like I remember, because I think it's 100% like about your heritage, your lived experience. But, you know, what you were saying, Annie, about generations, like the intergenerational difference. Like I had all of that all at the same time, right? And like being the first one, like there was one other woman of color, but she was like, I think in her 40s already. And like I like could tell like was just not in the same place that I was. So like luckily I feel like I like going to a predominantly white university helped me kind of prepare for that like business acumen. I got a business degree, not realizing that like it was a perfect transition into like the political space. But like what the privilege that I felt, and it's taken me a long time to like articulate this, but the privilege I felt was like having my other people's lived experiences, right? Like when you're in executive session, closed door, like nobody's having these conversations, or, you know, just with staff or in different meetings that maybe not everyone's privy to, right? Publicly, people are a little more on their better behavior, right? Like watch themselves more. But the deference to like what the like quote truth was, right? Like the deference that my colleagues got when they would talk about like their experiences growing up or their beliefs and like why that was like they said it as a fact, like when it was just like their opinion and lived experience, but that like privilege that deference was given to them. And I didn't realize why I was so frustrated and uncomfortable at first. And it was that. And I remember I had to think, like, how do I get people to hear me, right? Like, how am I like navigating this? And I don't know if I even have like did it intentionally or unintentionally, but like I guess just trying to make sure that like I had space, and little by little just trying to like accept it for myself that they just shared their opinion, right? Like breaking it down. And like we're nodding our heads, we're like in agreement. So let me try that and see how that goes, right? And then like when people would try to argue, like one thing I knew I could lean on, you can't tell me what my lived experience was. Yep. We could talk about facts and blah, blah, blah. And let me tell you, facts don't feel like facts after a while, because there's always facts that you can use to argue one point or another.
You telling a lawyer this,
yes,
girl?
I know. Believe me, I'm like, this experience has made me want to like go to law school, because I'm just like, man, just like the mental gymnastics. Yeah. We could talk later, Annie. But just like, I'm like, okay, so if that's like why isn't that still given to me? Why do you get to argue about what I'm saying? Because one thing I am an expert in that you cannot take away, and it's really easy to like take jabs at, right? I was 23. I was like newbie, like wasn't involved in a political party per se. Like there was just so many things. So yeah, no, I realized that early on, and it took a while to like have the language, but the language and just like being able to identify it is so empowering to be able to like navigate those spaces, right? And I think there was, again, a little bit about culture and a little bit about generations, right? Like that opinion and just perspective about what an office should look like or could look like, and like maybe not having such rigid like lines around those definitions. That was fun. I'm glad I was not the first and only. Like there are other colleagues like Juan, and hopefully with this next election and some other folks who have been elected since, that I think makes it feel like there is that change, right? Like that is possible, right? So I'm fortunate that it's not just like the lone wolf there, because it felt like that for a little while, and it was tough.
Yeah. I like calling it strategically authentic.
Yeah.
And I don't mean that in an insincere way, but I think that's something that's definitely, and I'm sure both of you live it every day, but even for me, like as an attorney, walking that very thin line of like, I'm going to be authentic to myself, but I need to is this the hill I'm dying on today?
Right.
You know, like being very strategic. And so learning how to maneuver some of these spaces in different ways than I maybe just inherently would, right? Like I might just come in and do something a certain way and then go, let me look at my audience. I'm in El Paso this month. I'm not going to act in El Paso the same way I act in Adams County. It's just, that's not going to happen. I'm still myself. And, you know, I may not water that down per se, but you definitely know your audience and you're strategic about that. And that gets frustrating because then at what point are you like selling out and selling yourself out? And what point are you whitewashing yourself, right? And like, where's that line at? And it's hard because as the non-default people, we don't get to define it, right? So it's this constant mental gymnastics, like you said earlier, of being yourself, but this version of yourself in this setting, arguing this point, because especially, and I want to kind of talk about that too, in terms of, you know, what kind of, you know, when you're in a room trying to make change and in terms of making change that can empower your community and can also hopefully make things more equitable in your community. Like how has that experience been for you?
Like you were just talking about like the expression, like the whitewashing, like the like too much, not enough, right? Like we've all kind of like talked about that theme, and I've definitely felt that way. And at the same time, like you are a grown adult, you have autonomy over your own decisions and how you want to show up. Like you, like when people say like trust people of color, trust Black women, like they're talking about trusting that individual in this society to navigate that for themselves, right? Like who are you to say that is the right or wrong way? But I feel you, right? Like internally wanting to feel like you're honoring your roots and your lived experience. And for me, like when I'm making decisions, like of course there's like, I feel like I've been practicing like the navigating different spaces that like it feels like second nature now. Like that used to be a very hard thing for me to do. It felt very uncomfortable. That's not where I'm at anymore, right? So like how do I maintain that like lived experience in my decision making? And I always remember like my grandma is like she can be the angel and the devil on my shoulder, right? And I love her for it. And like if it wasn't clear and like what I was saying, like how I am, you know, here in this space, like I come from a very matriarchal family. Like my abuelita would always say like ¿qué te cuesta? You know what I mean? Like what's it to you? What is it? Does it really cost you anything to be a better person, right? And in the back of my mind, I try to be there, right? As much as like 100%, like I'm gonna fight for like equity in all spaces. And for me, like that translates into like affordable housing, right? Like basic things that I think we should all have access to, right? Livable wages, right? And for people to feel that they are safe, right? And you know, I'm specifically talking about what happened to Elijah McClain, right? That happened in my district, 5 minutes from where I live. And the only difference between us, like we were both 23 when something life-changing happened, and we're both from Aurora. The only difference is that I'm not Black, right? So trying to honor people's different lived experiences and what does it cost you to fight for those people, right? For people who you may not realize like you have a lot more in common with and have the same struggle, right? So to me, the expression of those values, aside from like the literal expression, like what you wear, how you navigate what you say, when you choose to kind of dip in and out of code switching in different cultures, it is very much about how I make decisions and trying to remember my own roots, right? Like there was a lot of struggle. I might not be struggling in the same way that they were, but how dare I forget that, right? Like how dare I ignore that? And so that's to me like how I make decisions and how I'm honoring my family's lived experience and my culture, right? And like, you know, we're not a monolith. So like, you know, another person could be, you know, identify with a similar story and not fight in the same way. Personally, I wouldn't know how, but but like the beauty about being Latino, Hispanic, you know, Mexican American, is that we get to be complicated people, right? And we get to be all of the things, and there isn't like a type of or way to be this in this body, right? And navigating. But I feel like I have a really strong North Star because of my family and like how I was raised.
we know it is a fact that whether it be a city council, whether it be a law firm, whether it be the bar, whether it be our government at other levels, when they're more accurately representative of their community, we get the kind of change we need to see in action, right? And so I wanted to kind of talk to both of you, maybe in general or specific, but in terms of like things that you feel that have come to change in Aurora that you recognize come because of you and because of your background, that this would not have happened had it not been for a more diverse city council, right? That kind of stuff is what I'm getting at. And I think probably, the Elijah McClain discussion is very on the nose with that. I'm not sure, in terms of just, it took how many bodies of people of color protesting for how long for us to get finally the iota, the bare minimum of justice, which is a case, right? Something that goes taken for granted in so many other circumstances. How many years, how many protests, how many people were arrested, then had the charges dropped, the civil case on mom's behalf. How much did it take for our AG to have to step in and be like, yo, okay, we're going to do something? And that obviously is very disheartening for our communities. And when I say our communities, I mean, BIPOC individuals and other disenfranchised or disadvantaged historically by the system, right? Like, exactly. Like none of us were Black, but we all felt what happened and understood the complete injustice that it ever took place. And the fact that the whole nation saw it and had eyes on Aurora, that's really intense and it's really heartbreaking. You don't ever want your city to get under the microscope and get attention for something that heartbreaking and that wrong.
That's right.
But in terms of,
But we gotta face our demons, so to speak, right?
100.
That happened, and it's incumbent upon us to deal with it, right?
Yeah.
And to talk about it. That's not something, and I think it would have, I don't think we would be in the same place we're at today had we not had people continuing to push. I 1000% feel that way locally and nationally. And so we can't take credit for that. You know what I mean? This is not a win for, win for a politician. This was a community, saying that this is enough, right? Yeah. And there were so many people who told them that they were wrong, right? They were the naysayers, and I'm glad people didn't buy into that, right? That they kept going, and we wouldn't be where we're at. But no. I guess you were talking about, Annie, about an example of this space. And for me, it was in my first year being elected to city council, it was the Denver Meadows Mobile Home Park. I think for the rest of my life, I will never forget what happened to this community and why and how. So, my district is Ward 1. It's the northwest part of Aurora. It is the original Aurora, the Colfax corridor, the former Stapleton, now Central Park Boulevard neighborhood. The Aurora part of that borders Aurora and Denver. Same with the Lowry neighborhood, redevelopment neighborhood, and Schutz Medical Campus. So a lot of redevelopment pressures over a district that is 57% Latino. Compared to the rest of the city, makes $20,000 on average less than the rest of the city. 20% have less than a 9th grade education. I've literally worked with resettlement agencies, and they put people in Aurora because in my part of Aurora specifically, because it's the more affordable, traditionally affordable part. So we're redeveloping, quote unquote, over communities that are vulnerable, right? That are at risk of being displaced. And Denver Meadows is a unfortunate example here, and I wish that wasn't the case. So it was a mobile home park, and for if you weren't aware, but the difference of a mobile home park, but perhaps with another type of home, is that the owners own the brick and mortar, right? They own the physical unit most times, not always, but they have the capacity to, but they don't own the land. And so they're always it's a naturally occurring source of affordable housing, right? We know we're in an affordable housing crisis nationally, now more than ever, you know. And the owner, some guy I think out of Florida who just owned the land, like had no like real ties to the community, decided he wanted to sell.
Yep.
And the laws in this country like give deference and greater power to people who own land, even though it was going to be displacing like 100 families who were predominantly like Spanish speaking immigrant families. Like they worked the laborious jobs in the community. Like they were like the bedrock of the community. Their kids went to Aurora Central nearby. It didn't matter. And we knew that there was no place for them to go because we know how exorbitant the cost of living is. Yep. The nearest, I think, after all of this happened, that somebody moved was Grand Junction. Like 4 hours from here, like that, they were displaced entirely from their like social networks, their work, their jobs. They were right next to a medical campus. I'm sure there's a reason they benefited from that just as much as anyone else would have. So he decided to sell. And you know what's like even like more terrible is that they were able to engage like a group called 9 to 5. They're like an advocacy organization. They do pretty incredible work. And they organized and they were able to get funding from resident owned communities, Rock USA, to buy their park. Like they weren't just like they did something about it, right? And like not that like makes this the inspiring story. Like they shouldn't have had to, right? But on top of the fact that they like fought for their right to be there, the owner was asking for a certain amount. I think it was like 20 million. I know. And they came up with over the asking price. It was like 20.5 million or something that they came up with over, you know, not over, but they went over that asking price, right? So like, sounds good, right? No, he all of a sudden decided that like, no, I'm going to push that to 27 million. Like for no, you know what I mean? Like I'm sure he had his reasons and like they tried, right? And we working with them and trying to get them, like trying to get it zoned a different way. There are other cities that allow, you know, things like right of first refusals on, you know, zoning in a particular way. And just going through that experience and like me being like so brand new, it was hard to like navigate. And like, what was frustrating was like working with our city attorneys, right? And like I mentioned that like I want to go to law school because like that experience like 100% solidified that for me. Like whenever I tried to push for something, like I know it's possible. I literally have been given that example in another state. Like I got the no and not the like, if you wanted to, here's how kind of thing. And like just like not having that like the acumen or the knowledge of the law, I felt like was a big barrier. And it was really frustrating to like try to help people help themselves and fight to preserve this land. Ultimately, like they weren't able to save their you know, mobile home park. And it was really disheartening. And at a minimum, we were able to get them relocation assistance, but that shouldn't be like the default. Like the default is like, sorry, you're out of luck.
SOL.
Yeah, you had to fight for like 4 years to just get like a couple thousand maybe like per unit, even though your whole life is going to be completely uprooted. And so like the fundamental question is like, what is our role as city council members and government? And we know it's like, you know, for me, like I would have been okay like having to like create a legal mechanism to allow them to stay, right? But it just wasn't there. Like it wasn't there. And I don't know if it was just part that the city attorney's office and like whoever was working on it like wasn't wanting to or didn't know how, or just you know, like they didn't have that same like connection, like the like reason to keep pushing, right?
And like skin in the fight.
Exactly. So I don't know, like it just I'll never forget that, because I just like that situation has made me believe that like land use in this country specifically and likely elsewhere is like the manifestation of inequities in this country.
Say that
right
again.
And yes,
seriously
it is. And if I were to say anything, like that's what it would be. It'd be land use law, or at least I think, right, there might be something more relevant, but you shouldn't have to have a law degree to like be able to like fight for the things that you like, basic things. And I think housing is one of them.
Yeah.
What about you, Anna? You have any examples or any positive or negative in terms of just like trying to be an agent of change?
Oh boy. No, I have a similar story. I guess I'll start with the city attorneys and the power that I think attorneys have in general. Like, yeah, seriously, being, having that education is a superpower in our society. But we were trying to do something about the issue of, big land speculators and like, real estate investment trusts buying up single family homes throughout the city. This has been a big issue since the Great Recession. Yeah. But it's kind of just like been put on steroids over the last 5-6 years.
Yeah.
And like one of the big ones in Aurora is Invitation Homes. Like to the point where they have such a large presence that they actually send us little letters in our inboxes, telling us, oh, look at all the services that we provide the Denver metro area and our residents love us. And, what's happening for those who might not be like in the loop is basically when a lot of folks are out selling their homes now, it's not being bought up by, an actual living, breathing person who intends to use it as their primary residence about 20% of the time. And, it's not a majority of the time, but that's still about a fifth of the time in most major markets throughout the U.S. And that has a huge impact on the cost of housing because these are the kinds of properties that go, well over asking, all cash up front, waived inspections, etc. Like, stuff that normal people wouldn't be able to actually, compete with. No. And that's kind of set the expectation for a lot of sellers. So that's part of what's, I think triggering the real estate bubble throughout the entire country. Yeah. And, a couple of us were like, that's not right. You can't compete with that. Like, everyone needs a home. It is a basic human necessity, right? And here we are treating it like stock. Like it's just a speculative commodity, right? It's an inelastic good. And anyone who tells you differently is lying to you. But so we go to the city attorneys and it's like, so what can we do here? Like how can we address this? Like, can we actually prohibit for like a certain period the sale of a single family home to an investor or someone who's not going to actually live in it for a certain period of time? Like let's say 90 days, right? Which is actually kind of modeled after what Hawaii does. And I got a 13-page memo telling me all the ways that we were going to violate the U.S. Constitution and that we have to meet this unbelievable burden of proof. And it's like they literally do this in Hawaii. Yeah, like because they had such a major issue over there that with a similar situation with just like
Airbnb-ing everything.
Pretty much, yeah. And that's also becoming an issue in Aurora, although, our staff maintains it's not that big of an issue, but I'm still kind of like, how many of these are going on that they're not actually even like getting licenses, right?
Exactly.
So, but anyway, so when we were just basically, like I said, 13 pages of no. Like very articulate ways to say no, even though this is done elsewhere in the United States. Like we operate under the same constitution, so why aren't they violating all of these things, right? Mm-hmm. So like it's that kind of frustrating like institutional roadblocks that definitely prohibit people who would actually have the political will to try to like, bring some sort of sanity and like some semblance even of equity, because that's not even equity. This is fighting chance, really, is what we're trying to do.
This is fighting for scraps.
For like regular people in our city. And who does this impact the most, Mm-hmm. So, I mean, that's just a, recent example. I mean, we can also go to like, the things that I don't think would have happened if we hadn't had the changes that we've had on our city council over the last several years, like an immigrant legal defense fund that we tried to set up for folks in Aurora. And, I think it was Crystal and Coombs who sponsored that. And, I got into my feelings about that conversation because it was going into such a horrible and racist place with some of the people who were calling in.
The vitriol was pretty intense.
Yeah. No, and it's like, again, like I don't have the legal portion of the immigrant experience, right? Like my family, but we have the cultural one. And I just hear all these people, they don't even give a shit about the cultural one. They're sitting here fixating on the legal one, And it's like what y'all are doing is basically saying, since our system is inequitable, treats people as though they're disposable, that we should continue to do that with the callousness that we've always approached this issue with, in spite of the fact that a fifth of our population in Aurora is not even born in the U.S. Like you'd think that having a $50,000, which is a small amount to begin with, but having that, in a city like Aurora would be like a common sense issue, because these are people who are like business owners and like the core of our labor force and like have children, in our community that might actually be citizens, and are going to lose their caretakers to our unjust and disgusting immigration system. So no, but we couldn't even get that done. So I guess to summarize, with the current dynamic, and I don't know if it's just in Aurora or if this is maybe something that other folks experience throughout the country. I've seen, some wins and some losses, but I feel like where we're currently at as change makers is taking some L's, but setting the narrative for a future win. You know what I mean?
I like that.
And I think that, it's tough. But it's a fight worth fighting. So.
Actually, I think on that note, I mean, that was lovely. I mean, it's a sad story, but it was a great way to kind of sum that all up in terms of, we've been talking about the law. We've been talking about the Hispanic and Latino community, of which in Colorado, we're kind of the bigger percentage of other communities that face, a lot of disparate and inequitable treatment. And, to both of your points, having a law degree is like a huge privilege, but also like I see it as an obligation, a moral obligation to give back in whether it be in your actual job or whether it be in your volunteer work, but to use it for good, right? To not continue to perpetuate the status quo. And so maybe those 13 pages is exactly what that was doing. It was, perpetuating that status quo without really doing that internal challenge of like, well, why is this the status quo, and why am I not choosing to be more creative and equitable in my interpretation of the law? I think that's something that we all, we recognize that it's not as black and white as we like to say it is sometimes. Certain things are for sure, but other things definitely are open to interpretation and open to, persuasive and zealous support and argument for it. And so, there's a lot of hope especially like in the DBA and CBA, to really bring up and foster this sense of obligation to make things better, of recognizing that power that you have, whether it's for right or for wrong. It comes with a lot of power, having that knowledge, that acumen, and that diploma, and that, that license, the state of Colorado license certificate, and, continuing to try to do good with that and bring change so that individuals like yourselves that are on the front lines have the ability to do the things we want. Like that legal defense issue, like objectively, I'm sure if you talk to a lot of people on the street, they would have been in agreement, but they either didn't know how to support it, didn't live in Aurora to support it, and then you have kind of circling back to the people that get involved in politics or the people that tend to have the privilege, time, power, and energy to do so. And so a lot of people are kept out of the conversation and the discussion because of that too. But I wanted just to close out and ask both of you, what does being Hispanic or Latino? I know we use them interchangeably. They're not interchangeable. I think that's really more of a reflection of the preference for Latino. But the celebration is called Hispanic, and it is what it is. But like, what does that mean to you, Juan?
Yeah, so I guess let's start that by saying that I was not really taught that much about Puerto Rican history. And I think that was, again, part of, because, my parents wanted to raise us like middle-class white kids. So it was more like, we have this language, we have parrandas, and we have, this food, and we have this kind of music and all that stuff. But the history of what happened on the island was never really taught to me as a child. I had to actually learn that as an adult. So I think my mother, though, and I know my father as well, but my mother especially, she knows that history. And I think it's part of what has shaped the way that she interacts with, I guess the norms of our society, right? So my mother is someone who doesn't really take no for an answer and advocates very furiously, and especially when she thinks something is unjust. And I think that's something that she kind of instilled in me, and I think that's something that I bring with me to my advocacy as a council member and also as a community activist. But yeah, like being a Latino with like, that kind of context of like the history of what happened in Puerto Rico, like we'd like to talk about it, how it's like, oh, it's a commonwealth, it's part of the U.S., it's great. And it's like, no, it's a colonized territory. And like heavily divested from any meaningful kind of infrastructure. The people are treated like second-class citizens, and that's just the people in San Juan. If you go out into the rural parts of the country, forget it. So yeah, I mean, it's, I guess, being, with the unique history of Puerto Rico as being, part colonized but also part colonizer.
Yeah.
Like my family, our roots go back to the conquistadors, to Francisco Pizarro, and but also we're Taino. I have So my great grandmother was Taino. So yeah, it is that mix that I think exemplifies a lot of the struggle in, not just Latin America, but also in the United States. So, and I think that perspective that it gives me is that we need to know our history in order to know where we're going. Yeah. We need to acknowledge what was done incorrectly and do everything we can to correct those injustices. So that's what that means to me in this role.
When I hear Hispanic, I say, like, that's my government name.
I know, right? Yeah, 100. I know. That's the box I'm forced to check.
Right.
Oh my God. And like, I think that like speaks to like the generational piece. Like I definitely feel more comfortable saying Latino, Latina specifically. Yeah. Mm-hmm. But I mean, I think we're a giant umbrella, right? Yeah. So like some people like want to use that, like, leveling with folks, and even like in academia, right? Like the Latinx, like the gender neutral version, I think would be so odd. Like my grandma would look at me sideways if I ever was like, yeah, I am Latinx.
Oh yeah, my 80-something-year-old grandma has rolled her eye. Latinx,
Latinx, no. So yeah, it's like, to me, it's like I never want to be like in a space where like I don't feel like I can connect or like level with just like the people, like just people. Yeah. So like so for me, like I would probably use like Latina, but I think even more like I remember growing up, like that like negotiation of not enough, too much.
Mm-hmm. Ni de aquí ni de allá.
Exactly. And like I remember I used to be like, no, I'm Mexican, like that is me.
Oh my gosh.
And like I'm like pretty light skinned, and like depending on like, I went to 8 different schools growing up. So like I got the like, when I was at South Middle School, they were like all Latino, right? So like I didn't feel that way. I didn't feel poor either, because we were all
poor,
like brown and poor basically. But like as they started moving like up to like the Cherry Creek School District, like oh my God, like that was like culture shock, right? And so started having like that like identity crisis. And then even in college, like I would still be like, yeah, no, I'm Mexican. It wasn't until I was like halfway across the world in Madrid, Spain. Like that's where I studied abroad. I ran across and like was out and about and ran into a group of students that were also Mexican, but from Mexico.
Oh, they check you mad quick.
And I was just like, they were like, oh, where are you from? And I was like, I didn't grow up in Mexico. So like that it was just like very eye-opening. And like it took me going halfway across the world to like really like reflect on what that identity meant to me, because even like speaking Spanish, like I was like, this is not like the same. Like none of the food was spicy, first of all. Like that was like the real upset. And like of course like I didn't know what
and Juan and I are like, oh yeah, it's not.
No, I was just like, what is this?
The Caribbean.
I had to really refine my palate. I was like, for like 2 weeks, I was just like kind of miserable because I didn't understand, because they like speak fast and then they chop off their words. So like instead of saying Colorado, it's like Colorado. And it's like really quick and like splicing things together. And it's just like, it was just funny. So like aside from that, but like it took me being halfway across the world to like gain some perspective, like outside of my own bubble, and to like really become comfortable. And now I'm like, I'm Mexican American. Like I gotta honor, like I literally did not grow up in Mexico, but I feel strongly about like my Mexican Latino heritage, that for me it is like I specifically say my name in English and Spanish, like Crystal Murillo. Like the parts where like we were recording our names like for re-election, like ought to be like on the, we're trying to be inclusive, these audio ballots. And I really struggled. I was like, how do I say my name? I've always said my name this way, but are voters gonna know
Crystal Murillo?
Yeah, are they gonna
Crystal
know?
Murillo.
I literally
Crystal
had
Murillo.
3 versions. Yeah, I was like, I was like, okay, do I say the Spanglish, the only Spanish, or just English? So like, is it Cristal Murillo? Is it Crystal Murillo? Or is it Crystal Murillo? I was like, I literally spent like hours, like, and it took 30 seconds to record. Like I think I like just ended with the Spanglish version. I was like, that's how I say my name. That is how I say my name. Like if there's something confusing about that, I don't know what to do about it, because that is how I say my name, And, we're in a place where it's like, there's enough Spanish culture here. Like our name is Colorado. Like that's a Spanish word. Like enough where I feel like the double L, let's just go for it, y'all.
Yeah.
But like, you know, if I can't like
you
even
can do
succeed, like that's where you got to just trust. Like I'm from here. Like, all right, that's just like what my gut's telling me. Like, let's not overcomplicate it. But legit it felt like a crisis I went through.
That's
like
me.
identity.
No, I get that. I remember when Mario Solis Marich was on the radio here on AM 760, and people would call in and yell at him because he would say Colorado's progressive talk, and people would call in and be like, "It's Colorado, brother." Like, no, seriously, like, so I hear that tension. But
I get it every time, like, I have to enter my appearance in court, and I'm like, Annie Martínez. Annie Martínez. Annie Martínez? Am I on?
what even is my name?
What is my, yeah, so
Turn back to you.
And I'm in front of a lot of the same, like, judicial officers. That's part of like kind of the appeal of what I do, is that I like being in the same county and getting to see the same people. And so I'm sure that they must think like, what the hell is wrong with her? Just pick a freaking pronunciation and stick with it. But
it's not that simple.
It's not that simple because, you know, for me it's Annie. But I go by Annie. I say it in English a lot. But, you know, my dad and always said Annie. You know, so that's what I'm used to. I'm used to the and then Martinez. But then you start to like anglicize it, and you're like Martinez. Or like I had a college professor say Martinez. I was like, yo,
come on.
You got to draw the line somewhere. That would be
that was the line was drawn.
Sir.
There was definitely the line drawn.
My last name at one of my workplaces in Texas was Smith for a while, because for some reason they couldn't say Marcano or Marcano.
I was about to say, you can't say Marcano.
Like phonetically, that's pretty.
It's pretty easy.
That's one of the easier
They
ones.
just weren't trying.
Yeah, and like I grew up
Which
getting
is
like
another problem.
Marconi, macaroni, like stuff like that. Like, no, seriously. But like I'm not even gonna try. Your name is Smith now. It's like, damn, that is straight up some Ellis Island shit.
Yeah, that's
Like, come on.
Like they just like erased
They just
all
gave
of that.
up.
They just like, here is this name for you. 'Cause
Right.
It's nice for us to say.
it's easier for me, and I'm the default.
Yeah.
So
you have to adjust to my comfortability.
No, exactly. Yeah.
Well, I think.
Well, I feel like we just got on a roll, and now you're like
did.
trying
We're
to
just
shut it
riffing
down.
here
I'm
now.
sorry, guys. My bad. Pero like. Did either of you have anything you wanted to add to wrap up?
No, this has been cool. I hope that this was, that the folks are going to find this to be like an interesting conversation.
I hope you like me.
Yeah, I hope that this was it gives you an insight into kind of like how we function as, Latino electeds.
Yeah.
Both in our own way, history makers in Aurora. So, yeah.
Well, and like, I'm sure like all of the other people that have like spoken, like we're not a monolith, and it's like 100% like a constant negotiation of like expressing your values as an individual, right? Because we do get to be complex individuals. Like, we didn't talk about the other parts of our lives, right? Like the intersection of like mental health, right?
Yeah.
Like when we are going through these like big changes in our lives. Like I remember being at a different place, struggling through some things in college, and then like a whole different set of issues that code switching, that like doubt, that like constant negotiation between cultures, and even for me like age and just like level of like what credibility means, like and I think at the end of the day, like those are all individual conversations in and of itself, but like I just remember I had to be my biggest advocate, and where and when and where I faltered, because I'm human, right? Like, and things get to me sometimes. Like surrounding yourself with people who like also believe that about yourself. There's nothing special you had to do to earn that love and support, except for they believe in the same things, and that you get to be this like polished and messy, complicated and simple person. Like you get to be all of those things in one body, and that they trust you to navigate and to show up in your own way, and like respect those boundaries, and just like fundamentally believe that. Like that's been I think the life lesson really for me, is like being your biggest advocate, and when and where you have moments where that's not necessarily possible, like making sure that you're tapping into your community, right? Tapping into folks who you can trust and are going to help you get through those things. And I imagine like I haven't been to law school, but I'm going to say that there might be those moments in like law school. I hear it's kind of stressful. That might be helpful to have. So, I don't know what I'm going to do, but I do, I work at DU. We have a law school there. So shout out if you did go to DU and went to law school there, but maybe that is a path for me, and like thinking about like how we continue to be change agents. Like there isn't a right or wrong or a perfect time. You just evolve in like your ability, capacity, and understanding of issues. And I don't regret coming into this so early. If anything, I feel like that's why I'm here today. And perhaps had I had a little more support in certain areas, things might have been different. But like, I also don't regret the journey, right? Like the process, like you kind of, and I'm stubborn. Like I feel like I have to learn the same lessons like 10 times over for me to get it. So maybe I was just preparing to learn those lessons earlier, because like I knew I needed to take a longer time to learn them, so that when I am like a different age or whatever, when I'm ready to like do something different, that I'm like, okay, we're moving on to the next one. I've finally learned this.
Well, I want to thank both of you for your time today, for being in the studio, and for joining me on behalf of the CBA and DBA to kind of continue the conversation about what it means to be Hispanic and how we use that to be either, as an attorney, as not an attorney, as an agent of change, like we talked about today. And, I really think our listeners are going to enjoy hearing the perspective of our younger leaders. I mean, Juan, you're, what were we saying? A middle-aged millennial?
Geriatric millennial.
And Crystal being more of a baby millennial, it sounds like.
Yeah, I'm like almost in Gen Z, which feels crazy to say.
But it's amazing to be able to like highlight that for our listeners and our members, to be able to see how things are evolving, and how, maybe they can play a role in ways that they never really thought or anticipated when they first started playing this podcast. So again, I want to thank you both for being in the studio. I want to thank the listeners. This was Bienvenidos. Thank you so much for joining us today. And catch you all later.
Bye.
Bye, y'all.
Bienvenidos, a CBA-DBA Limited Series podcast celebrating Hispanic Heritage Month, has been brought to you by the Colorado and Denver Bar Associations. On behalf of your host, Annie Martínez, thank you for listening. Gracias por acompañarnos hoy.